So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So the very first lecture on this particular text, we talked about the cultural background, the political background of this text, out of which this novel emerges. We sort of discussed Conrad's location apropos of imperialism and how this novel, if it doesn't deconstruct, at least it problematizes some of the commonly assumed notions about imperialism at that time. And we also discussed how, despite its political incorrectness, or perhaps because of its political incorrectness, this particular novel or novella, is still relevant to the world we exist in, the world we exist today. Because of its political incorrectness, because of its very problematic entanglement between a certain political presupposition and the problem with that presupposition. Because in one sense, Heart of Darkness is not really decrying imperialism. It's not really saying imperialism is a bad thing. It's not really saying imperialism should not have happened at all. It's not that radical in that sense. It's very much a conservative novel. It does belong to the conservative tradition of novel writing. But unlike the novels of Kipling, for instance, unlike the novels of Rider Haggard at that point of time, it doesn't really glamorize imperialism. It doesn't really glorify imperialism at all. It just depicts to you the discomfort about imperialism that happens so often. And of course, the entire enigma, the entire existential crisis, the entire psychological situation in the novel, is all from a white man's lens. So in that sense, it's very racially inflected. No non-white person speaks in this novel. So the entire narrative is depicted and delivered and dished out by a white man through a white imagination. But despite that, the discomfort about imperialism is something which this novel dramatizes quite interestingly. And that's the reason why it's a very relevant novel for us today, especially given the current geopolitical situations that we encounter in the world we live in today. So in this lecture, we will dive into the text. We'll start with the main text and we'll see the opening of Heart of Darkness is interesting because, like most great novels, the opening sets a tone for what is to follow. And also, it just sort of characterizes the narrator to a certain extent. And we talked about how the different kinds of narrators in Heart of Darkness. There's one unnamed narrator, someone who lives outside the narrative frame. This is almost third-person narrator. And then we have the inset narrator, Marlowe, the one who tells the real story about going to Congo. And he's unreliable, he's nervous, he's decadent, he's failing in his narrative. And he's the one who's really interesting. He's a character narrator. So he is someone who actually experienced what he is telling about, what he's talking about now. And in one sense, Heart of Darkness is basically an anti-novel. It's about the failure of putting an experience into a narrative. It's about the failure of narrativization. In that sense, it becomes a very, very experimental novel. It's a successful novel about the failure of narrativization. So in that sense, it's one of the early postmodern novels, if you want to consider it that way. It does definitely have an unreliable narrator. It does definitely have someone who's nervous, someone who's not reliable, someone who's not omnipresent, someone who's no knowledge whatsoever, even in retrospect, what happened, right? So that, in that sense, the narrator character in Heart of Darkness is a very postmodern narrator character. It's not a trickster character. It's not tricking you. It's not leading you down the garden path deliberately. But he himself doesn't quite know what had happened. So he's struggling to tell the story. And that struggle to tell the story is something which Heart of Darkness dramatizes quite movingly, quite compellingly, in my mind. Okay, so in that note, let's look at the novel. Let's look at how the novel begins. It's set in London. It's set in Thames in London, the river in London. And the entire story takes place from that boat. There's a boat called Nellie, in which the narrative begins. So they're all sailing. There are 4 or 5 people away up. They're all sailing the Thames in a river in a boat called Nellie. And in that setting, Marlowe, the narrator character, he starts telling a story about what happened to him when he went to Congo. So interestingly, the two rivers are an interesting contrast to each other. One is the river of civilization, quote unquote, the high point, the high tide of imperialism. And the other river, Congo, is the other river, like literally the other river, is the alterity of civilization. It's a non-civilized river, but essentially that's the river which feeds Thames, in terms of the mercantile commerce, the mercantile economy, but also the economy of civilization. So the entire civilization, as it is seen in London over here, is dependent on what comes in from the Congo in that sense. So there's a sense of shame and guilt about that as well in Heart of Darkness. So the two rivers are very interestingly juxtaposed with each other, are very interestingly contrasted with each other. And if you remember, we just finished Rabindranath Tagore's short story, The Postmaster, and even there we found that how natural signifiers, natural markers are reflective of psychological situatedness. So we had, for instance, if you remember the end of the story, when the postmaster is coming back from the village back to Calcutta, sailing back to Calcutta, everything around him seems to cry, everything around him seems to moan the departure that he's doing from the other character, Ratan. And nature seems to be weeping, it's a swelling river, it's monsoon coming in, everything seems to be sad, on the brink of sadness, so swelling with sadness. So we saw there again how natural signifiers and natural markers are reflective of emotional situations. And we have similar settings here in Heart of Darkness as well. So take a look at the opening of Heart of Darkness. This should be on your screen now. The Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made, the wind was nearly calm, and being bound down by the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. So it begins with the image of stillness. We have Nelly, a cruising yawl, a boat-like thing, where the characters are floating in the River Thames, and we are told that a flood had been made, the wind was calm, and now it's just waiting for the turn of the tide, really. So it's a moment of stillness between two tides. So at the very opening, we have several conceptual things coming in. So first of all, the concept of fluidity is important over here. The Nelly, the river, the boat Nelly is flowing in that little River Thames. So the sense of fluidity is very palpable over here. The sense of liminality between two conditions, between two tides, the stillness between two tides, that's been captured here as well. So you have these two categories at the very onset, the very outset of the novel, dramatized and depicted to us. The sea reach of the Thames stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. So again, the interminability, the endlessness of the waterway is part of fluidity, the fluidity of imagination, the fluidity of human consciousness. And most of us who are even tangentially aware of modernism and modernist literature, and this is very much the beginning of high modernism, we must have come by a term called stream of consciousness. Right? It's a technique. It was a term used by William James, the brother of Henry James. William James is a philosopher, a psychologist, philosopher of the mind, who's increasingly relevant in the studies of neuroscience today. So just before I came to this lecture, I was looking at an interview by Ian McCohen, who was talking about his new novel, The Nutshell. And there, the novel is about an embryo in a woman's womb. The character is actually an embryo. The narrator is actually an embryo, a child who is not yet born. So while talking about that novel, McCohen describes and alludes to Henry James, an entire idea of Henry James, that every emotional movement in the mind has a physical manifestation. In other words, emotions and physicality are interlinked with each other, natively connected to each other. So emotions are not really something in there. Emotions are very physical. There's a viscerality about emotions, which is something that Henry James theorized and what modern neuroscience corroborates. So it was a bit of a digression, but I think it's helpful in that sense, because what we see over here is an example of stream of consciousness. It's quite literally a stream of consciousness. So they're actually in a stream, an endless fluid stream out of the River Thames, but it also unfolds into a stream of consciousness. So again, we see how the landscape and the mindscape are dialoguing with each other in a very, very complex cognitive way. So the interminable waterway quite literally becomes a stream of consciousness here in this novel, the very outset of Heart of Darkness. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a join. So again, look at the endlessness of nature around. The sea and the sky are welded together without a join. And in luminous space, the tan sails of the barges drifting up with the tide seemed to stand in red clusters, seemed to stand still in red clusters of canvas sharply peaked, with gleams of varnish spritz. So again, the whole idea of stillness and liminality and fluidity and endlessness. We have all these things coming in, and they're also smuggled in, as it were, using natural material signifiers, material markers. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and further back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and the greatest town on earth. So, this is a description of London, as you can see, the biggest and greatest town on earth. But we see very quickly how the bigness and the greatness of London are actually directly dependent on the darkness, which is imperialism. And, it's Congo feeding Thames. That's what happens in How to Darkness. And we saw, and this is what I may have mentioned already in my opening lecture on How to Darkness, we see that the Heart of Darkness is not really out there in Africa. It's not really out there in the Congo. It's actually in there, in here. In a site of civilization is also actually the Heart of Darkness, right? So the biggest, greatest town on earth has a tone of irony to it, has a ring of irony to it, which gets more accentuated as we move on in this novel. So at this moment, we have the experience of London over here, the whole idea of Thames, the whole idea of the endlessness of Thames, which is blending onto the sky, which is potentially endless. And then there's a mournful gloom brooding, motionless, of the biggest and the greatest town on earth. So we see this one little line over here. It actually says a lot of things. So on the one hand, we have the positive markers, or markers of positivity, biggest, greatest town on earth. We have those positive, lovely epithets, biggest, greatest town. But we also see how the biggest, greatest town is surrounded and pervaded, or blanketed in a way, by a mournful gloom, brooding, motionless. So we have this decadence coming over the biggest, greatest town on earth. And therein lies the complexity about imperialism and How to Darkness. And on one hand, there is a celebration of imperialism, this very conservative sanctioning of imperialism by Conrad, who is essentially a conservative writer, and acknowledging London as the biggest, greatest town on earth. But also we see how the biggest, greatest town on earth also contains a very mournful gloom, the blanket of mournfulness, the blanket of bleakness, as it were, which is part of the biggest and greatest package. So you have this ambivalence which is coming in, and that's a very important word in How to Darkness, ambivalence, which literally means, sometimes we talk about ambivalence as confusion. We talk about ambivalence as synonymous with confusion. But actually there's a bit of a difference between ambivalence and confusion. Ambivalence is the ability to contain two valences together at any given point in time. So ambi is two, valence is value. So both values existing simultaneously, or situated simultaneously. That's what ambivalence essentially means. So there is an ambivalent attitude towards imperialism, which we see in How to Darkness. Okay, and we can see how that ambivalence is sort of communicated to us using very natural signifiers, just like we saw Tagore use similar signifiers, while actually talking about the human mind and human emotions in the short story Postmaster, which we finished before we began this. Okay, so now we have the description of characters here and there, and we'll just move on a bit. Now, if we come to this bit of the novel where we should be on a screen, where the character is describing Marlowe, and the physical description of Marlowe is important. But he's a storyteller in How to Darkness, and he becomes this decadent, sad storyteller, the inadequate storyteller, so to say. And that's what Marlowe is in How to Darkness. And how does he first appear in the novel is an important image. Okay. Marlowe sat cross-legged, right aft, leaning against the mizzen mast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outward, resembled an idol. Okay, so the whole idea of idol, the very sad prophet, the very sad god, something sad godlike about Marlowe. So he had sunken cheeks. So we see immediately he embodies decadence. He embodies a sense of enervation, exhaustion. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion. So again, the paleness, the jaundice complexion, is something which is very, very immediately visible in Marlowe. The straight back, an ascetic aspect, and it's not really an earthly man. It's not really someone who's supposedly with a family. So there's something ascetic, something detached about him from earthly activities. And with his arms dropped, the palms of hands outwards resembled an idol. So again, the word idol is important, and we'll come back to it later. And we find towards the end of the novel, Marlowe is compared to Buddha. So he has enlightenment, but then of course the whole irony in that statement is his enlightenment is not one of positivity, it's not one of brightness, it's not one of illumination. His enlightenment is actually one of darkness. So the only enlightenment available to Marlowe, the only enlightenment available to him is one of darkness. The knowledge is one of darkness, it's not one of illumination, it's not one of vastness or bigness. So the only enlightenment, the only truth available to Marlowe, the only truth embodied by Marlowe through his prophetic and godlike quality is that of darkness. Okay, And now we're told that we felt meditative and fit for nothing but placid staring. So again, the whole idea of still staring is important. There is a degree of meditativeness, meditative quality over here, which is important. We felt meditative and fit for nothing but placid staring. The day was ending in a serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. So again, ambivalence, serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. Right, so there's a degree of decadence, the day was ending. So the twilight quality is important. The twilight is literally the threshold quality between day and night, the threshold time, the temporal marker between day and night. That's what twilight is. And we have a similar kind of setting over here. The water shone pacifically. The sky without a speck was a benign immensity of unstained light. The very mist on the Essex marsh was like a gauzy and radiant fabric hung from the wooded rises inland and draping the low shows and diaphanous falls. Only the gloom to the west, brooding over the upper reaches, became more somber every minute, as if angered by the approach of the sun. So again, we see how the ambivalence is situated and dramatized over here. So on the one hand, we have positivity, benign immensity, completely untouched illumination, radiant fabric, etc. So all these phrases are important markers of positivity. But then we also have the gloom of the west, brooding over the upper reaches, became more somber every minute. So the somber quality, the brooding quality, the gloom-like quality, that becomes very interesting and juxtaposed and entangled with any markers of positivity and radiance that we saw just in a sentence before. So we have this ambivalence coming in and dramatized very, very interestingly over here. Okay. And at last, in its curved and imperceptible fall, the sun sank low, and from glowing white changed to a dull red without rays and without heat, as if about to go out suddenly, stricken to death by the touch of the gloom brooding. So we have again the sense of death, the image of death coming, the sun setting. And it's very symbolic, if you remember, if you pay attention to what is actually being told to us in between the lines, and it's open to interpretation as well. The very image of the sun setting, it becomes obviously a natural phenomenon, a cosmic phenomenon, if you will, but also it's a very symbolic political phenomenon, because the image of the sun was very stereotypically used with the entire narrative of the British Empire, as you know, and the very, very popular, pompous and arrogant saying that the sun never sets in the British Empire. I mean, it's just an endless empire, an endless stretch of geopolitical glory, which was described, which is sort of allegorized in a way by the non-setting sun. But over here we have the image of the setting sun. The sun is actually setting, and that becomes very quickly and symbolically an image of the empire coming to an end, an image of the empire exhausting itself out, right? So it's almost becomes a thermodynamic image of exhaustion, and we can connect it very quickly to the image of exhaustion and experience of exhaustion that is embodied by Marlowe. As we just seen, the very appearance of Marlowe, the first time he appears in a novel, he appears as someone who is enervated. There's a godlike quality about him, but he's like a sad, tired god, a sad, exhausted god, right? And that exhaustion and sadness become markers of his embodiment throughout the novel, along with nervousness and a sense of traumatic reawakening, which he embodies all the time. Now, the image of the setting sun is important, and you should pay some attention to it as a very symbolic image. The setting sun, which is obviously telling you something about the empire, about the entire consumption of the glorious empire, the commonly consumed idea of the empire as a glorious, endless enterprise. That is coming to an end. That is actually symbolically being challenged and subverted and sort of undercut to a certain extent by the image of the setting sun, and of course the gloom brooding. Right, okay. And then immediately we are given a change. Again, it's important to understand how the natural markers of change are basically corresponding with the markers in the mind. Forthwith, a change came over the waters, and the serenity became less brilliant but more profound. So again, look at the shift from brilliant to profound. Profound, obviously, over here, it's suggestive of a degree of somber-like quality. The old river and its broad reach rested unruffled at the decline of day. The word decline is important. The decline of day, after ages of good service done to the race that peopled its banks, spread out in its tranquil dignity of a waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth. So we have now very clear images of exhaustion and termination coming in. So the degree of termination, or the terminator-like quality, is important over here at the end of the earth. So it's almost like the river is coming to an end, and which is contrasted with the endlessness with which the novel began, really. And we are also told that the decline of the day, again a very important phrase, the decline of the day is also a decline of the river. I mean, the river had served many men, has done a great service to a race of people, the people as banks through different points of time, but now it's coming to an exhausted end. And the sense of exhaustion and ending is something which keeps coming back. It's like a recursive marker in its narrative way here. We looked at the venerable stream not in a vivid flush of the short day that comes and departs forever, but in the august light of abiding memories. The august light of abiding memories is important here. What is this august light of abiding memories? And that's quite literally the stream of consciousness. That's quite literally the state of mind. And what we see in Heart of Darkness is that how the mind and the landscape, the mindscape and the landscape, that actually seems to be different categories at different points of time. They sort of blend with each other, and oftentimes what is described as natural signifiers are actually being used to talk about the mind, to talk about the mood, to talk about the emotional situatedness of the character at that point of time. And indeed, nothing is easier for a man who has, as a phrase goes, followed the sea with reverence and affection, that to evoke the great spirit of the past upon the lower reaches of the Thames. So again, the whole idea of following the sea, being a follower of fluidity, or someone who's spent an entire lifetime being fluid and liminal, and now the whole idea of looking at the River Thames becomes, it's like a déjà vu of your life. It's like a retelling of what you experienced in your life as a seaman. The tidal currents runs to and fro in its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships it had borne to the rest of the home and or to the battles of the sea. So again, we have the River Thames over here becomes like it ceases to be a natural physical river. It actually becomes a stream of consciousness which contains the endlessness of historical time. Right, so there's a different kinds of human historical time, and very soon we have markers of human history coming in. The different people, the different figures mentioned are historical figures over here, and they become markers of certain kind of civilization, a certain kind of activity which the Thames has witnessed over periods of time. And look at the markers, look at the figures mentioned or alluded to in this particular section. Okay, it had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights old, titled and untitled, the great knights errant of the sea. So two characters over here, Francis Drake and Sir John Franklin, the two mentioned characters over here. Again, they're interesting characters because both of them are titled as knights, Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Franklin, but we know that Francis Drake was also essentially a pirate. So the very thin borderline, the very blurring borderline between being a pirate and being a national hero is something which is alluded to over here, because on one hand he looted other ships, especially Spanish ships, and Francis Drake, I mean, at that time the sea was controlled by the English and the Spanish Armada, and it was a great competition, as you would know, about controlling the sea. So the Spanish also extended the empire, they also expanded the empire in other directions, and English in some other direction. But essentially those are a rival, and of course the Dutch as well, the Portuguese as well. But Francis Drake becomes a national hero for England because of the amount of money, amount of wealth he looted from other ships, which is the reason why he was knighted in the first place. So again, the very thin line between a shameful, illegal activity of looting and being a pirate and that of national glory, that of becoming a knight, is depicted over here with that image, that allusion to one figure, Francis Drake. It was described as a great knights errant of the sea. It had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time, from the Golden Hind returning with her rotten flanks full of treasure to be visited by the Queen's Highness, and thus pass out of a gigantic tale to the Erebus and Terror, bound on the other conquest that never returned. So again, look at the liminality, look at the ambivalence over here. The Golden Hind is a historical ship which returned with full of treasure, right? Of course, treasure over here means colonial booty. I mean, it just came back with having looted different colonies, it exploited the colonies, right? And that beauty, that exploited entire wealth of exploited ornaments and things and treasure, that was welcomed and embraced by the Queen. So essentially we see how what is being hinted at, there's a very degree of insinuation over here, is that how national treasure amassed by England through the different colonial conquests were actually looted and exploited treasure that came back from certain ships, which were then marked, which would then become figures and metaphors of national glory. And of course, there are other ships as well, like Erebus and Terra, which went off for other conquests but never returned. So again, we have this juxtaposition of glory and death, of shame and heroism, which constantly runs throughout side by side without ceasing to be together. It had known the ships and the men. They sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith, the adventurers and the settlers, king's ships and the ships of men, unchanged captains, admirals, the dark interlopers of the eastern trade, and the commissioned generals of East India fleets. So again, the commissioned generals of East India fleets. So look at the way in which the word generals and the word interlopers are put within quotes. So again, we have a sense of tradesmen slash pirates slash national heroes all put together, right? So East India fleets, as you know, the East India Company ruled India for the first 100 years before the Queen took over. So what started off as a mercantile activity very quickly became a military activity and then became a political activity of control, right? But then what we are told over here is very, very ambivalently how the ships and his fleets and his figures who are worshipped as heroes, they're essentially pirates, they're essentially tradesmen who wanted to exploit the different ships, the different other countries, the different other colonies across the world. And that's how the British colonialism began in the first place. Okay. Hunters of gold are pursuers of fame. They're all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, the messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. So again, all these lovely images of glory and heroism and a very masculinist enterprise. If you can see, the entire idea of imperialism was a very masculinist activity. What greatness had not floated from that on that ebb of that river into the mystery of that unknown earth, the dreams of men and the seeds of commonwealth, the germs of empires. So again, if you take a look at the last sentence over here, it does tell you a lot of things. The dreams of men, the seeds of commonwealths, the germs of empire. So this is a river which is seen, which is witnessed, the birth of empires, the beginning of empires. This is how the empires began. And this very masculinist, heroic narrative, noble narrative about building an empire, dreaming of empire, creating an empire. It all started from that River Thames. So, the river in this particular passage, it ceases to be a natural river. It becomes a marker of time. It becomes a consciousness. It becomes a stream which contains different points of historical time. And what is being said over and over again is an empire as a glorious, lovely activity, activity which brought in wealth, which brought in glory, which brought in national pride, etc. But the ambivalence is always there. And look at the very next line, which sort of conveys what we are discussing already. The sun set. Look at the finality in that little phrase. The sun set. The dusk fell on the stream and lights began to appear along the shore. So, the very beginning, the very line before that, the very sentence before that contains the image of the river as one of glorification, as one of heroism, as one of illumination, as one of expansive, activity, something which is forward-looking, something which is glorified and heroic, etc. And the very next line goes to the very first phrase, the sun set. Right? So again, the sun over here becomes a symbolic sun. It's a sun which constantly is alluded to as that which never sets in the British Empire. So, it's the beginning of the empire's end, so to say. The image of exhaustion comes in over here. And along with the image of exhaustion comes the image of ambivalence, the image of acknowledgement of failure to a great extent. Okay. And the lights began to appear along the shore. The Chapman Lighthouse, a three-legged thing erect on a mud flat, shone strongly. Lights of ships moved in the fairway, a great stir of lights going up and going down. And further west, on the upper reaches, the place of the monstrous town marked ominously on the sky, a brooding gloom and sunshine, a lurid glare under the stars. So again, look at the adjectives interesting over here. Monstrous town. Ominously, that's again, it's a marker of something about to come to an end, a marker of something negative about to happen. A brooding gloom. It almost has a ghost-like quality. It almost has a sepulchral quality to it, right? So degree of deadness, ghost-like thing, spectral thing. So spectrality is very, very evident, and it's very opening of heart of darkness. It's got specters coming in, shadows coming in, specters coming in, specters of heroism, specters of glorification, but also specters which are pointing towards something which is about to happen, right? So the spectrality at the opening of Heart of Darkness is something which we must pay attention to. A lurid glance under the stars, okay? So the word lurid is important over here. And then we have the first line spoken by Marlowe, and first time spoken by any person in the narrative, as it were. And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. Now, this particular line is important because what it shows is the entire interchangeability of light and darkness. And this is what I mentioned, this is what I meant when I mentioned that what we see as we read this particular novel is how the heart of darkness is not really out there, it's not really the exotic other place of Africa, which is Congo. The heart of darkness is actually situated what is commonly consumed at the site of civilization, which is Thames, London, Brussels, and the white places, the white markets, or the mark is the white supremacy, the mark is the white civilizational supremacy, right? Those actually are the heart of darkness as it emerges in a novel. Now, what Marlowe says over here is interesting. He says that no place, there has been no place on the history of the earth which has never been a dark place, a heart of darkness. So this also what appears to be the site of civilization, what appears to be the site of supremacy, the site of civilization supremacy and expansionist enterprise, has been one of the dark places of the earth, right? So the darkness over here, it takes many intonations. It is physical darkness, natural darkness, but also metaphysical darkness, also existential darkness, also political darkness, also civilizational darkness. All these different kinds of different orders of darkness come in here to depict what is being said over here. He was the only man of us who still followed the sea, right? So again, the whole idea of following the sea is important. So these are a bunch of people who presumably have lived all their life in the sea, in different capacities. But Marlowe is the only person who still follows the sea, who still goes out and voyages. And again, the whole idea of journeying over here becomes very, very psychological. So it's a journey which is geographical, political, physical, natural, but also emotional, inward looking, right? So the conquest in Heart of Darkness is also an inquest. It's looking inside. Okay, the worst that could be said about him or of him was that he did not represent his class. Again, the class of seaman, the class of sailor. Marlowe did not represent the class. He represents something else. It's a very different, brooding kind of man, and that's not something which you commonly see about a sailor, because a common perception about a sailor, the stereotypical perception of a sailor, the way it's consumed, is that someone is very earthly, someone who swears a lot. So again, the whole idea of swearing like a sailor is almost a proverb. But Marlowe is not like that. Marlowe is a brooding, introspective character, and that introspective quality is important for us to highlight, to remember. He was a seaman, but he was a wanderer too, while most seamen led, if one may so express it, a sedentary life. So the whole idea of someone who is a wanderer, right? So wandering, a journey person, someone who's journeying all the time, it takes up a different capacity, it takes up a different existential quality. It's someone who's journeying all the time in the mind. So the journey becomes a mind journey, a mindful journey, an existential traveling. And that's something which is highlighted over and over again. Their minds are of this stay-at-home order, and their home is always with them, the ship, and so is their country, the sea. One ship is very much like another, and the sea is always the same. In the immutability of the surroundings, the foreign shores, the foreign faces, the changing immensity of life glide past, veiled not by a sense of mystery, but by a slightly disdainful ignorance. For there's nothing mysterious to a seaman unless it be the sea itself, which is a mistress of his existence and as unscrutable as destiny. For the rest, after his hours of work, a casual stroll or a casual spree on shore suffices to unfold for him the secret of a whole continent, and generally he finds the secret not worth knowing. The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlowe was not typical. Now, before I come to this section, it's a very complex thing with which I'll end, but what is being said about seamen is that people who travel by the sea all the time, their stories become interchangeable. So everywhere they go, they don't really travel. It's just a physical thing, and all they do sometimes is get off the shore and take a little walk. And in that little walk, they appear to pick up everything that is worth knowing about the place. So the yarns of seamen, or the stories of seamen tell to each other and also to other people, have a directness, have a direct simplicity about them. It's about adventures, perhaps, it's about people, it's about otherness, etc. But the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. And that's a very important metaphor, a very interesting metaphor of a storytelling quality, of a storytelling activity. So the entire activity of storytelling lies within a shell of a cracked nut. So it's just one shell inside a cracked nut. So it's easy to grasp. it's easy to consume, it's easy to possess, it's easy to lay your hands to and understand. So there's nothing inscrutable, there's nothing non-understandable about seaman's stories. They're about adventures, they're about glory, they're about danger, they're about exotic things, etc. So it's the commonly grasped knowledge of travelers, okay, where the entire idea of story is within a cracked nut. So the nut is cracked and a seed is inside the nut. So it's graspable, it's consumable, it's holdable, it's possessible, and that's something which is commonly characteristic of seaman stories. But contrast that to Marlowe's stories, and this is what it gets interesting. But what kind of stories did Marlowe dish out? But Marlowe was not typical, right? So he was not a typical seaman. He was a very different kind of a seaman. His stories were different. How so? If his propensity to spin yarns be accepted, that's the only commonality he had with other seamen, that he had a propensity to tell stories, had a propensity to tell what happened to him, to spin yarns, to spin out stories. Okay, that was the only commonality. His inclination to tell stories, but that's the only thing that was where it ended. Really, that was a commonality ended there. The similarity ended there. Now, everything apart from Marlowe, everything about Marlowe was different, was exceptional, right? So his stories were different. The way he told his stories are very, very different. And how so? We'll find out now. And to him, the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze, in the likeness of one of those mystery halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illumination of moonshine. The word spectral, I've already used it, but then this is what Conrad is also giving you, so that just corresponds, it corroborates our reading so far. But what we're told essentially over here is, for Marlowe and for Marlowe's stories, the meaning doesn't lie inside the story, it's outside the story. So right, it's like a concentric circle, it's like a halo, mystery halo. So it's not really tangible, it's not really palpable, it's not something you can touch and possess and occupy and interpret and understand immediately. So there is a degree of spectrality, there's a degree of mystery, there's a degree of unending quality about Marlowe's stories. There's no kernel inside, there's no center of the story, but it's got eccentric circles, it's got concentric circles, right? And this centerlessness of Marlowe's stories is something which is very, very important for us. And that sets the tone for what is to follow in Heart of Darkness, right? So I'll just wind up away, I'll just stop here for this particular lecture, but just to very quickly summarize this particular section, because it's a very, very important section, and that tells us the quality of Marlowe's storytelling, the nature of Marlowe's storytelling essentially. And what is that? That he was an untypical storyteller, an untypical seaman storyteller. Okay, so his stories are very, very untypical. It's got nothing to do with the way normal adventure stories are told. And this is sort of almost meta-fictional, because we just seen how Conrad's stories are very unlike, let's say, Rider Haggard stories or Rudyard Kipling stories. They're not really adventure tales, they're actually anti-adventure tales. They're about decadence, they're about existential confusion, they're about cognitive confusion. And Marlowe, who is essentially the character inside, the Conrad character inside this particular story, because remember, Conrad too was a traveler. He traveled extensively across the world around that time of imperialism. But we are told that Marlowe's stories do not really have a center inside, they're centerless. They have rings, spectral rings around the stories, and the meaning doesn't lie inside but outside, and it's always slipping away. And the slipperiness of meaning, the centerlessness of meaning, is something which is described by this phrase, a spectral illumination of moonshine, right? So it's not really sunshine, it's not really a centered thing, it's not really a kernel in which there's a seed that you can grasp and find a meaning of. There's no such thing in Marlowe stories. But we have instead is a sense of unending spectrality, endless spectrality, which characterizes his stories. And this is what characterizes Heart of Darkness as well. So from this point, we'll start reading the novel extensively in certain selected passages, and we find how this quality of centerlessness, of slipperiness, of not having any inside, there's no interiority at all, there's a degree of hollowness about a story, and that is something which pervades the entire novel of Heart of Darkness, which we'll cover in the lectures to come. So I'll stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this in the next lectures. Thank you for your attention.